By the late 17th century, the entire kingdom of Spain was engulfed in rumors and fear. People whispered about a strange king, Charles II, known by a ghostly nickname, El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. To them, he resembled no monarch who had ever worn the crown. His deformed appearance, bizarre behavior, childlike voice, and erratic temperament all convinced the public that their king had been possessed by demons from the moment of his birth. From lavish royal palaces to humble public squares, the tale of the cursed king spread like wildfire. People claimed that witches had cast spells on the Spanish royal family, that the devil had tainted the royal bloodline, rendering the monarch feeble, infertile, and mad. Yet when the mist of superstition is cleared away and history's light is cast upon the story, a cold and cruel truth emerges. Charles II was not bewitched. He was the tragic victim of a very real curse, the genetic decay caused by centuries of inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty. The House of Habsburg was one of the most powerful families in Europe for centuries. They ruled through military might, diplomacy, and above all, strategic marriage, often with close relatives. They believed that maintaining pure royal blood would secure their power, but the price was steep. Generation after generation of increasingly frail, deformed, and mentally diminished descendants. Charles II was the most tragic product of this policy. His father, Philip IV, married his own niece. His mother was also a direct Habsburg descendant. From both sides of the family, harmful genetic traits combined with inescapable consequences. The result was a child born with deformities, developmental defects, and complete infertility, yet destined to rule an empire. Thus, the legend of El Hechizado became a painful metaphor, a dynasty so obsessed with retaining power that it poisoned its own future. While the people feared him and the court saw him as a burden, Charles II was in fact a living symbol of the price of absolute ambition. One of Charles II's most bizarre features, and the most visible hallmark of the Habsburg bloodline, was his severely protruding jaw, which left his mouth constantly agape. This was not merely a cosmetic defect, it was a serious hereditary condition known medically as mandibular prognathism, an overgrown lower jaw that juts forward abnormally. In European history, however, it became widely known by a simpler name, the Habsburg jaw. For Charles II, this deformity was more than disfigurement. It crippled basic human functions like eating and speaking. He couldn't chew properly, his teeth never met, so food had to be mashed as if for an infant. Throughout his reign, Spain's monarch lived on porridge, soup, and soft meals, despite sitting on the throne of a vast empire. Speaking was also a challenge. Records of the time note that Charles had a severe speech impediment. His voice was so distorted that people often couldn't understand what he was saying, a terrifying limitation for a ruler. At court, ministers frequently had to interpret his intentions from facial expressions and gestures, as his words no longer carried authority, but confusion. That gaping jaw, seemingly a mere physical flaw, was in fact the most vivid indictment of an entire dynasty's sins. The Habsburgs were infamous for preserving power through marriage, not by allying with other royal houses, but by marrying within their own. Uncles married nieces, brothers wed sisters, generation after generation. These unions were not only unnatural, but they corrupted the family's genetic health. Charles II was the final product of over 200 years of inbreeding. The purity they sought was actually genetic erosion, producing increasingly deformed, weak, and intellectually impaired heirs. A modern study analyzed over 20 portraits of Habsburg royals and found that the extent of jaw protrusion was directly proportional to the degree of inbreeding between the parents. In other words, the more closely related the couple, the more disfigured the child. Charles II ranked highest. His jaw was the most extreme in the dynasty's entire history. Worse still, no one dared speak the truth. In official portraits, Charles was painted with a long, narrow face and a closed mouth, a fantastical image, utterly disconnected from the painful reality. It was the court's attempt to cover the truth with art, as if brushstrokes could gloss over a genetic tragedy that was slowly eating away the throne from within. But no matter how much color was layered on top, the true face of Charles II remained an unerasable indictment of the Habsburgs' failed marriage policy. Every time he struggled to bite into a crust of bread, every time he spoke and no one understood, the past spoke too, reminding the world that unchecked ambition always leaves scars, in bone and blood and on the faces of innocent children. If Charles's jaw was the external sign of genetic collapse, then his entire body was the ultimate evidence of the disaster inbred unions had brought to the Habsburgs. Not just his face, but his posture, movement, and mental development were cruelly stunted. Charles couldn't walk like a normal child. While others ran by age 1 or 2, Charles took his first steps at 8. Even then, he stumbled and wobbled, as if his body had never truly learned to balance. The reason lay in his severely disproportionate frame. His head was too large for his frail torso. His neck was so thin and weak that it couldn't support his head for long. His shoulders slumped, his spine curved, his joints loose and unsteady. The result was a weary, warped figure, wholly unfit for the majesty expected of a king. Charles II was trapped between two worlds, a child in an adult's body, yet fulfilling neither role adequately. His deformed body not only made him physically weak, but also contributed to delayed cognitive development. Historical records suggest that Charles had the intelligence of a 5-year-old. Despite being a grown man, he learned to read very slowly, taking years to string together even simple words. His short-term memory was so poor that he couldn't recall conversations from earlier in the day. His political decisions were often driven by impulsive emotions rather than rational thought. Charles frequently threw tantrums, screamed, or stomped his feet like a child when denied his wishes. He couldn't regulate his emotions, failed to engage in logical conversation, and had no grasp of the long-term consequences of his choices. His appearance bore visible signs of illness, too. Charles had thin, patchy hair that fell out in clumps, so much so that court painters routinely added extra hair to his portraits, creating an image of a king with a thick, flowing mane entirely at odds with reality. Artists would straighten his hunched back, widen his vacant eyes, and rouge his pale cheeks to mask his frailty. This obsession with hiding his weakness led the court to strictly control Charles's public image. Few outside the royal inner circle were permitted to see him in person. Official portraits weren't records of truth, they were lies crafted to deceive history, presenting a perfect king who never truly existed. Yet no amount of concealment could hide the truth. Whenever Charles shuffled slowly through the palace or had to be lifted off his throne after a sudden dizzy spell, his body did not obey him, his mind did not serve him, and his empire could no longer rely on him. Charles wasn't just an unfortunate man, he was a living warning of the perils of power-blinded ambition. While generations of royals secured their thrones through intermarriage between siblings, nieces, and uncles, Charles was the final result of this chain of errors, a king who could not rule, learn, walk unaided, or protect himself. Looking at Charles II's frail frame, hunched back, and confused eyes, one no longer saw the might of a great empire, but rather a body crushed by the weight of unchecked genetic ambition. In the history of European monarchies, few kings were as haunted by the pressure to produce an heir as Charles II of Spain, not from a longing for fatherhood, but from the immense duty to continue the Habsburg dynasty. Tragedy struck when Charles, despite marrying twice, remained childless, and his infertility was not just a private sorrow, it sparked a continental succession crisis. Charles was born with numerous deformities, the product of generations of inbreeding. But his most devastating and most hidden defect lay in his reproductive organs. According to many records, his penis was underdeveloped, his testicles functioned poorly, and he was entirely infertile. This explains why, despite two politically crucial marriages, Charles never fathered a child. When suspicion grew at court, blame tinged with duty and guilt quickly fell upon the women around him. In 1679, Charles married Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of Louis XIV of France. A beautiful 17-year-old bride, she was expected to strengthen the Franco-Spanish alliance. But after years without children, the Spanish court held her solely responsible. She was forced to undergo fertility tests, take bizarre medications, and even drink holy water mixed with powdered saints' bones to break the curse. The young queen became depressed and isolated, surrounded by a hostile court. In 1689, Maria Louise died in agony and mystery, possibly poisoned, or perhaps a victim of the treatments she endured. After her death, Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess known for her family's fertility. She had 22 siblings. The court hoped she would save the Habsburg bloodline. That hope quickly vanished. On their wedding night, Maria Anna was shocked by Charles's frail appearance and feeble condition. All attempts at consummating the marriage failed. From that moment, she knew, this king would never produce an heir. Desperate to find a solution, the court tried every imaginable treatment. Royal physicians prescribed herbs, aphrodisiacs, ground rhino horn, tiger bone balm, and curse-breaking elixirs. Many still believed Charles was bewitched. Magicians and priests were summoned to the palace to perform exorcisms, anoint him with holy oils, chant prayers, and burn talismans. At one point, Charles was taken to a monastery and forced to bathe in animal blood to cleanse the curse. Nothing worked. His body simply could not create life. The truth that Charles II could not father a child triggered one of the greatest succession crises in European history. All of Europe watched anxiously to see who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire with its massive colonies in the Americas, Italy, and the Netherlands. When Charles died in 1700 without a direct heir, the War of the Spanish Succession 1701 to 1714 broke out, dragging in nearly every major European power. France, England, Austria, the Netherlands all plunged into battle over the inheritance of a man who could never leave a son behind. Charles II was the death knell of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. His childless death not only marked the end of a reign, but also exposed the rot at the heart of a power maintained through generations of inbreeding. No heir, no vitality, no future. He was the last king of a decaying dynasty, consumed by its own bloodline. When medicine failed to cure Charles II, the ailing king of Spain, both the court and the public had nowhere left to turn but the spiritual realm. They believed this deformed, frail, and sterile monarch was not merely sick, he was possessed. As this belief turned into collective obsession, royal exorcisms became a repeated ritual within the palace, where reason and fear blurred together, creating one of the strangest chapters in the history of the Habsburg Empire. Charles II was a living enigma to physicians. His body defied natural laws: an abnormally large head, brittle bones, poor digestion, undeveloped genitals, and unstable mental states. After repeated failures using tonics, herbs, and special diets, royal doctors finally gave up. In this vacuum, priests and occultists found their voice. They declared, "The king has been cursed." The rumor spread so widely that exorcisms were publicly held within the Madrid palace, attended by senior advisors and even commoners from outside the royal court. One of the most infamous rituals took place right in the throne room of Charles II. By then, the king was nearly immobile, mentally unstable, and barely able to speak. During the ceremony, Catholic priests mixed holy water with powdered relic bones of saints and forced him to drink it to cleanse his soul. After the first few sips, Charles began to convulse, vomit, and collapse to the floor. But instead of panic, those present chanted prayers. They believed this was the devil being expelled from the king's body. The ritual lasted for hours, accompanied by chants, incense smoke, and Charles's screams of pain. He was no longer a king but a sacrificial body in a mystical rite. After the ceremony ended, Charles II was left exhausted. More disturbingly, he claimed to feel a little better, perhaps due to psychological comfort or merely a physiological reaction to the seizures. Whatever the reason, the king became convinced that exorcisms worked. From then on, Charles personally requested more exorcisms. In court journals, There's an entry noting that he once pleaded with a priest, "Please, do another session. I felt lighter after the last one." This belief turned the ritual into a routine in the royal court, conducted whenever he fell ill or felt uneasy. A part of the exorcism involved burning items suspected of being possessed, from pillows, wooden chairs, and mirrors to even the king's cloaks. Everything was thrown into the fire. They believed evil spirits lurked in every object, and only fire and prayer could purify them. One scene was recorded by an Italian historian present at the palace. "I saw the courtiers burning a mirror the king often used. Black smoke rose, and the king watched while trembling. They said the mirror had allowed Satan's spirit to enter." These palace purifications damaged many parts of the royal residence. Charles's chambers were constantly altered, as every item was suspected of harboring evil spirits. In the end, the Madrid royal palace became a bizarre supernatural temple where reason had no voice. Charles II lived in a world where every misfortune was blamed on curses, spells, and possession. Even nobles, royal family members, and foreign ambassadors were swept into the hysteria. Some sent word back home, stating that Spain is ruled by a man imprisoned by demons. Exorcisms could not heal Charles II. No miracle ever came, but the rituals exposed a painful truth. An entire dynasty had abandoned reason to cling to superstition when its own genetic legacy turned the heir into a symbol of inherited death. Without children, without strength, and trapped in bizarre supernatural rituals, Charles II ended his life as a cursed king, not by demons, but by his very own bloodline. On November 1, 1700, King Charles II of Spain drew his final breath after a life full of suffering, illness, and isolation. He died at 38, a young age for a monarch, but an eternity for someone born with a deformed body and a soul weighed down by superstition, suspicion, and inbreeding. His death did not merely end the Habsburg line in Spain, it opened one of the most disturbing chapters in royal European history, a secret and shocking autopsy. Charles II had been sickly his whole life. In his final years, he was often bedridden, half-blind, unable to digest food, unable to speak, and prone to seizures from headaches and hallucinations. Palace physicians described him as a man alive, but decaying by the day. Upon his death, the Spanish court immediately imposed a lockdown on all information. They banned any detail about the king's death or his body from being released and simply announced, "The king rests in the Lord." But behind this silence was a terrifying secret autopsy, whose findings horrified everyone present, so much so that many swore never to speak of it again. The chief royal physician, known only by his initials in official documents, was primarily responsible. His report, preserved in the royal court's confidential archives, painted a horrifying picture. The heart was as small as a walnut, shriveled and dark, as if blood had never properly circulated through this body. The lungs were rotting, releasing a nauseating stench the moment the chest was opened. The lung tissues had decayed into sludge, making it impossible to distinguish membranes from the trachea. The stomach and intestines were decomposed, filled with black, foul-smelling liquid, a sign that the digestive system had likely never functioned normally. The liver was shrunken, fibrotic, and incapable of detoxifying the body. When Charles II's skull was opened, the doctors found a large amount of thick, whitish fluid coating the entire brain. This substance, possibly caused by hydrocephalus or congenital meningitis, explained the king's intellectual underdevelopment, erratic behavior, and slow learning from childhood until death. His brain was not only small, its lobes were poorly defined, as if it had never fully developed the basic structures required for normal function. He had once been called a child in a grown man's body, and at the autopsy, this was no longer an insult. It was a biological fact. The reason Charles II could not produce an heir was now evident. His genitals were underdeveloped, with a penis the size of a child's, atrophied testicles, and no signs of normal hormonal function. The doctor concluded that Charles had produced almost no male sex hormones. yet another outcome of generations of inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty. Queens who had once been blamed, subjected to humiliating examinations, forced to take treatments, and publicly shamed, were now, after the king's death, finally vindicated. The problem had never been with them, the problem was the king himself. The final line in the autopsy report read, "No single organ was left intact. It is astonishing that he lived to 38, a blunt, chilling conclusion, yet also a ruthless confirmation of a tragedy that spanned medicine, politics, and royal lineage. Charles II was someone who perhaps should never have been born, and the fact that he survived 38 years, through exorcisms, seizures, and social isolation, might have been the greatest miracle of his life." Charles II left no offspring. His death ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, one of early modern Europe's bloodiest conflicts. But behind the treaties, the negotiations, and the maps redrawing power, stood the haunting image of a man broken by heredity, a body long dead, whose flesh simply refused to let go. When King Charles II of Spain took his last breath in 1700, his death marked more than the end of a life. It was the death knell of an empire built on blood and incestuous marriages and a manic lust for power. Charles had no children, nor were there any other members of the Spanish Habsburg line capable of succession. They had all died young, gone mad, or were infertile due to severe inbreeding. For centuries, the family had tried to keep the throne within their bloodline by marrying cousins, uncles to nieces, nieces to their maternal uncles. The result of this pure preservation was Charles II, a man who was barely alive, incapable of love, leadership, or reproduction. His death created a massive power vacuum, not just in Spain but across Europe. Who would inherit his vast empire, which included Spain, the American colonies, southern Italy, the Netherlands, and other territories. The two dominant powers at the time, France under Louis XIV and Austria under Leopold I, also a Habsburg, both claimed the throne. In his final days, Charles named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. Austria protested immediately. England objected. The Netherlands objected. All feared the merging of Spain and France into an unprecedented superempire. Thus, the War of the Spanish Succession broke out. From 1701 to 1714, Europe plunged into total war. The fields of Germany, northern Italy, Belgium, and Spain ran red with blood. Over 400,000 soldiers died, not counting civilians, refugees, or those who starved or succumbed to disease. And it all began with one strange cause, an infertile king. No one wanted war over a will, but all of Europe understood that Charles II was the product of a diseased political system where power mattered more than love, bloodline more than health, and thrones more than the lives of unborn children. The Habsburgs had once been Europe's most glorious dynasty, ruling from Spain to Austria, from Bohemia to South America, but they were also victims of their own obsession with absolute power. For nearly 3 centuries, the Habsburgs imprisoned themselves in blood-bound marriages to retain the throne. But the price they paid was deformity, madness, infertility, and collapse. Charles II was no anomaly, he was the final product, the genetic distillation of all their mistakes. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Philip was recognized as King of Spain, but had to renounce his right to the French throne, splitting the two empires to prevent a union. The Habsburgs lost Spain, lost the people's loyalty, and became a shadow of their former selves. Their legacy wasn't tea castles or crowns. It was a cautionary tale of how ambition can destroy through blood. Charles II died, taking with him a false age of glory. His death didn't just spark a bloody war, it exposed the decaying core of one of history's most powerful dynasties. And in the end, it was Habsburg blood, the very thing they tried to preserve at all costs, that destroyed them.